one of the downsides of that dude's channel is that it's less about, hey, here's just what buildings look like in Romania, and more, oh, here's like the architectural history. I mean, it's actually called that, like Romanian architectural historian or whatever he called it. Um, and I would rather just see what stuff looks like right now, because he's doing stuff that's more like, here's, 17th, 18th, 19th century design stuff, and that's cool, but I'm just not personally a fan of the look of architecture of that period of history, just in general, like worldwide. But I do like seeing the more modern urban landscapes kind of wherever they're at. And unfortunately, it seems like, like even that staircase video he had, that it's like a relic of the 1800s or something. And unfortunately, it seems like my only choice from what I've seen so far is to just like catch glimpses of the staircases and the elevator videos. Like, it's not the point of the videos, but I get like, like, not seriously, but kind of facetiously, pseudo pissed. It's like, no, quit fucking, like, they just walk out of the elevator, turn around and go back, and it's like, no, damn it, walk down the fucking hallway, go up the stairs. I want to see the staircase. And it's interesting because a lot of the staircase designs, I mean, a big part of it for me is not just the staircase peculiarities or particulars rather, but even like, the handrail designs. Like, there's some pretty interesting, like on the Romanian channels I've seen, some pretty interesting looking staircases, or how there will be like support columns of the building that sort of intersect the staircase a little bit. So it'll be there's this bit where the stairs are sort of like narrower because there's a little bit of wall there, if that makes sense. Or something that's, you don't really see this a lot in like American or Western architecture that I can think of, but I see this a lot in like kind of like Slavic or post-Soviet, Warsaw Pact, whatever type of, East European, like whatever you want to call it, type of areas, um, where they'll have windows where the staircase is kind of in front of the window. It's like a staircase built right up against a window, but like I don't know even how to really describe it. But also there's interesting things where like the bottom half of the wall will be, like between floors in the hallway there, like that whole wall will be a window, but like the top floor, like the bottom half of the wall is a window. You just have this random, just like floor level window that, nothing could ever fall out of. I don't know, it's just kind of interesting, but that's something I noticed with more like Eastern European architecture, is this whole staircase next to a window kind of thing. Um, but like particularly on that Romanian dude's channel with the elevators, which is what kind of spurred me on this in the first place. Oh, that reminds me, actually, that staircase thing that the one dude was talking about is actually called a spur. But it's just this kind of weird bump in one of the stairs that motherfuckers would like step out of the carriage onto to not have to like step into the dirt or whatever. But spur in the verb sense of, kind of, started. My interest was, these Romanian elevator, this one dude's channel, a lot of the handrails, that's one of my main interests of staircase designs. Some of those are like pretty intricate, and I actually like just how visually distinct they are from kind of like American designs. Like, you really don't see a lot of shit like that in the US. Um, but they would have these weird kind of, the smaller rails underneath the main ones, or between the main ones, and like underneath the banister, um, that they kind of don't even really seem to provide any support. They're like just there for decoration. But also I notice like a lot of times is like the angle that they will follow will be actually different from the angle of the stairs themselves. Like, if you're like kind of measuring the angle, like the hypotenuse from like, the start of, one run to another or whatever. Which, if I was making a staircase in Hammer Editor, it would piss me off, right? Like when I did the staircase I mentioned before, I actually did that with the handrail initially because I don't know, the way I positioned it and the grid views. I guess I like missed, like I like looked at it wrong, and I actually like fixed it. And now I realize maybe I shouldn't have done that because that's actually more accurate to the type of staircases I was kind of inspired by in the moment. But another thing that's kind of more endemic of European architecture in general is this whole like radiators in like hallways and staircases and stuff. You don't really see that a lot in American buildings anymore. I have been in ones that have them, but I mean they're rare. Which I mean, the U.S. is quite a bit newer than a lot of countries, so that's sort of not super surprising. But something I noticed, and I'm actually, I believe it was a Romania video. There's some staircase in a building, and it was Romania or some country around there. Now the dude's video is he was sounded like he was Australian or something. He's probably a tourist or whatever. But the staircase he walked up, one of the things I noticed is that at the top of the stairs there were two radiators on the wall. But what I thought was cool about it, and this is something I've never even thought of before, is they had actually painted the radiators to match the design that was on the wall itself, right? So where the radiators sort of overlapped it, they had actually painted it to make it like from head on look kind of continuous. But also like when you're standing off to the side, that kind of relief that it has from the wall and how it breaks up the lines. I just think that looks really cool. But yeah, I haven't done a whole lot of mapping in years now. And the primary reason, at least right now, is I mean, aside from hammer crashing constantly, my computer is it's like it's just pegged at 90% memory usage all the time. And if it goes much over 90%, it'll start to like legit lock up. And I can't afford that. I just need the piece of shit to just at least work at all. Um, but even if I close down a lot of shit, the best I can manage without closing anything that I really need to keep open is maybe like 75 to 80% memory usage. And so that's kind of in my way. Some games I used to have installed I don't have installed right now, and I don't have a way to install them. But the crashing of hammer all the time is in a way sort of secondary to that. But something I haven't done since like 2004 when it was new, because I've been looking at different mapping related shit lately, and I found some of those like painkiller editor tutorials on ModDB. And the editor for painkiller is something I haven't fucked with since the game was like brand new. And as I mentioned, I always thought the design, like workflow or whatever, for painkiller was interesting because at the time I was more familiar with the CSG, brushwork and light map versus vertex lit geometry type of paradigm that Quake derivatives like Source Engine have. And I didn't fuck with Painkiller's editor a whole lot, but it did inspire me in a lot of ways. So at one point around 2011ish, when UDK was a thing, Unreal Development Kit, and you start to really get these kind of more convenient interfaces. One thing that I would do is I would actually create an environment in 3ds Max, and then I would render the radiosity lighting, and then I would do the kind of auto unwrap, which is a unrealistically large texture, like I mentioned in one of the other videos. But then something else I would do that UDK would allow you to do is, so I would have the mostly static shadows baked, um, and they weren't even a separate map like light map. I just baked them straight into the diffuse texture to save on texture renders or whatever. And what UDK would allow you to do is set up dynamic lights that would cast like dynamic shadows, but you could actually kind of limit the area that the shadow could cast. So I could, for an example, have a light in a room or hallway or whatever, and limit the extent of the dynamic shadow of the character or other dynamic objects such that they wouldn't overlap with the static shadows. So they would look like they more blended together and look a bit more natural. I kind of wish unified lighting had caught on. There was a few games that kind of did kind of shit in that realm. Like Max Payne 2 had that like directional shadows that would blend a little bit better with the static lighting. And then like the Hitman games up to like like Blood Money had like what at the time they called drop shadows. So it was essentially like dynamic shadows, except for most objects they were treated as static. But so they basically got rendered once and that was it. But the nice thing was because it used the same thing as like the character shadows. They didn't like overlap each other or look unnatural so much. But it's kind of unfortunate, and it reminded me because I saw some Halo related videos earlier, and it reminded me back in, and I actually looked it up, so I now I know which one it was for sure. When I was a kid, I had a November 2002 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly that had previews of Halo 2, and to show how long the dynamic shadow volumes and normal map stuff was already technically possible, those early previews of Halo 2 made it look like it was going to have that. Now, of course, it ended up not having it, but yeah, I used to be I used to have that. I had played Combat Evolved on the OG Xbox. I was at the time looking forward to Halo 2. I never actually played it, but at the time I was looking forward to it. And of course, I was hyped for Doom 3. And there was, Deus Ex Invisible War had shadow volumes and normal maps, even in, on the original Xbox that I played it on, which is where I played it back in '03. And it's just interesting to see how long that stuff has been around, and yet, for whatever reason, shadow volumes never caught on really, or shadow maps, right? Like the so-called unified lighting and shadowing, methodology that was, kind of big for a moment with like Doom 3 and Fear and Condemned Criminal Origins, but something that Halo was supposed to do at a point was basically mix those together, like mix the shadow volumes with the pre-baked lighting. So you had more natural kind of radiosity-ish looking stuff from the pre-baked, but then still the dynamic shadows on top of it. I thought that would have been a good idea. You can sort of mimic it in a way with so-called fill lights in like, Doom 3's engine or Quake 4 or whatever, but it's a lot of extra render passes and it can get pretty expensive pretty fast, even if you disable the dynamic shadows and like the specular lighting of the so-called fill lights. All they are is just a separate light entity that you disable shadows for pretty much. But, there was a point in time when like pre-computed radiance transfer and different shit like that was a possibility. But the culmination of that, like what might have been possible at that era, actually ended up showing up with like CS:GO, where it had the normal light mapped lighting, but then it had the orthographic shadow map from the sun shadow, right? So it like faded out at a distance, but you know it was dynamic up close, but then in the distance you at least had the static shadows, and they kind of went together pretty well. And I don't know why games want to waste so much resources on dynamic, like real time radiosity and all this shit, because it doesn't ever look good. It wastes resources. When pre-baked GI and all these other kind of artist controlled methods end up looking way better anyway. And like, again, you can still have dynamic shadows with it. but they just have it so they can, do their UE5 nanite, sell the latest RTX card bullshit.